Hello everybody, welcome to video 16. Today we're going to take a look at types of fractures. Now this is one of my favorite lectures out of all that we do over the course of anatomy and physiology, just because we actually get to play doctor a little bit more. We actually get to look at some fractures, we look at some x-rays and get to learn the various types that there are. I will warn you, we will see a fracture that is fairly gruesome towards the beginning of this lecture. I'll warn you again as it comes close though. So when we look at the types of fractures you can have, there's two kind of generic categories of fractures, and those are going to be your simple or your closed fractures, and then your compound or your open fractures. And we'll take a look at the difference between those two on the next slide here. But there are seven types of fractures, basically 7 different ways that we might see a bone break. And we'll list those here: the green stick, comminuted, impacted, transverse, oblique, spiral, and stress. And again, we'll go over these. They'll each get their own slide, so you get to see what they look like and what each of them can be caused by and some various things like that. So simple and compound fractures, they are just they're opposites of one another. It all depends on whether or not the broken bone has pierced the skin, or the broken bones have pierced the skin. Your closed fractures, they're going to be closed. So they're going to be all your fractures that do not break the skin. Open fractures, your compound fractures, then do break through the skin. Obviously, compound fractures are the ones that are significantly worse. Usually that bone has been broken with such force or with such impact that it has driven it through the skin, and being exposed to the environment does make it very likely, or I should say much more likely, for that fracture to become infected. So here is a simple fracture, a closed fracture. We have here a tibia that is fractured. We'll go over what type of fracture this is here in a minute. But you can see the fibula appears to be intact, so whatever it is that caused this tibia to break, it was not such a great impact that the bone was driven through the skin. Now, and then here is your final warning. This next one is the gruesome picture. Here we see another fractured tibia, and I believe in this case the fibula was also fractured. But this happened at an NCAA tournament March Madness game a few years ago. You can see the Louisville Cardinal symbol there. But basically this basketball player, I believe he went to stop, and he planted that foot, and then the tibia just broke. And then he stopped with such force that tibia broke, and you can kind of see that tibia is a little pointed. It was driven through the skin. So it was very gruesome, but you can tell that both bones were broken here just based on this leg, this foot hanging limply. Okay, that's the most gruesome that it'll be for this video. The first type of fracture we'll look at is a green stick fracture. So it gets its name from the way that young green sticks normally break. And if you've ever tried to do that in the spring, in reality, they don't really break. They kind of snap partway through, and then they start to peel. Green stick fractures are the same way. The bone will break for just a little bit, it'll snap a little bit, and then the bone will start to peel. So the bone is not completely fractured through, and it sounds pretty gruesome, but actually it's not as bad. Usually we see this in children just because their bones are not as brittle. They have a lot more collagen in them, so that prevents the bone from completely snapping in two. We can see this image here side by side. You can see this green stick, how it snapped kind of halfway through and then begun to peel. And then on this x-ray here, I believe this is a ulna. Might be an ulna, might be a fibula, I can't really tell here. But you can see that bone right there, it's broke partially, part of the way through, and then the bone has started to peel all the way up there. So those are green stick fractures. Comminuted fractures, these tend to be everybody's favorite. This is when the bone breaks into several fragments. Really, 3 or more fragments is going to constitute a comminuted fracture. So we can see here, this is a femur that has suffered a comminuted fracture. You can see femur is broken into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 7 or 8 pieces there. Usually these are going to be due to high impact or high energy impacts to a part of the bone in a very small area. So for example, things like a gunshot wound can cause a comminuted fracture. Impact fractures, these are going to be when the ends of a bone end up being pushed together, and then just that stress from both sides of that bone kind of pushing in the middle is going to cause some sort of fracture to form. So we can see here the fracture of the fifth metacarpal right there. Usually we see these if somebody, and I would anticipate somebody with this x-ray, they fell and they went to plant their hand was kind of straight up and down, and that impact caused that bone to break. Just that impact, you had the force from the ground, force from the arm falling, just caused that bone to snap in half. It just could not withstand that pressure. Transverse fractures, these are pretty simple, although they aren't necessarily simple fractures. The bone is going to break clean across. It'll be a straight across fracture. So here, this is a very textbook transverse fracture of the tibia here. That is almost completely horizontal with the ground that we see that fracture take place there. So that to get that fixed, you're definitely going to, a big bone like tibia, you might end up having a rod through it. But it is fairly easy to make sure that you are able to center that bone and get everything set back straight. Oblique fractures, these are going to be just like transverse fractures, except they're going to be at an angle. They're going to be at an oblique angle. So we see this one here. Again, another tibia fracture. I don't know why I chose a whole bunch of tibia pictures, but that fracture you can see runs diagonally across that tibia. We're looking at this from the side, but that is definitely an oblique fracture through that tibia. Spiral fractures, these are interesting. These are a type of oblique fracture that actually they spiral around the bone. So that's where they get the name spiral. So think of it as a stripe on a candy cane. This one here is textbook spiral fracture. It's very, very easy to see how it started on the back side of the femur here. And then as it moved up, as the oblique fracture moved up, it also spirals around the bone. In fact, it actually makes a full 360-degree turn by the end of it. Spiral fractures are rare, but when a spiral fracture occurs, you can almost guarantee that whenever the impact happened that caused the fracture, the person was also twisting whatever bone that was. So in this case, somebody with a spiral fracture of the femur, they may have landed, and when they landed, it was with such impact that the bone was breaking, but at the same time their foot was stuck, and then as they twisted, that bone was breaking, and it caused, instead of an oblique fracture, it caused that twisting motion, caused the spiral to travel up the bone or to travel through the bone. And then lastly, we have stress fractures. These are going to be fractures, again, they don't go completely through the bone. Instead, really, you're going to see some sort of crack in the bone. These are very, very difficult to see on x-ray. They can be hairline fractures, very, very small fractures. It's really, really tough to tell on here. You can just kind of see a little bit of extra calcium deposits on this fifth metatarsal on this x-ray, but otherwise you need to be a very skilled x-ray technician in order to see these stress fractures. So that is the types of fractures between the two categories, whether or not it went through the skin or not, and then the 7 ways bones can break. There are other names and other fractures out there, things like the avulsion fracture. We aren't going to cover those in class unless somebody wants to ask about them and learn about them. But those are the types of fractures that you need to know for this class.